everybody, this is Ingrid. Welcome to the CX Bank Financial Security online conference. And this afternoon session is around domestic violence, financial abuse, mental health, and also gender equality. So I'd like Kathy to start, please. Tell us a bit about your background, Kathy.
Well, my background is for the last 5 years I've been working as a workplace humanist chaplain. I focus on being the first responder, so that means I triage people where they need to go in terms of trauma. The two top things that a chaplaincy conversation, bearing in mind it's about presence and about listening to people. The two top issues are domestic and family violence and mental health. Close third is financial stresses. So it's sort of a no-brainer that I'm, involved in this conversation. The thing that really concerns me in the banking and financial sector, and yes, we've had the Royal Commission, is I don't believe they've got their head around domestic and family violence. I think they're still operating in a silo system. I don't think that they are working together as a holistic solution. And we were just talking prior to the beginning of this webinar, is money is the solution. It can provide a roof over your head, it can provide access and to the right psychological support, bearing in mind the limitations of Medicare. It can provide retraining or entry to work. They're all things we should think about. The gender issue and money is really not looked at. I mean, we have the banks all suddenly starting women's groups like, Women in Focus and Ruby Connection, and I'm not singling out any of the banks for a reason, but remember in the 70s, women were just starting to be able to get loans themselves. These days, we are not taking into account the sheer volume of trauma that women are impacted by domestic and family violence, and what that actually means to getting a loan or getting social financial products. And we are not thinking adequately as a sector, banking and financial sector, about this in regard to the social determinants of health. And by that I mean things like housing and employment and connection and family and friends. Those sorts of environments all make up social determinants of health, and the industry is looking at that in terms of their product base.
Thank you, Kathy. Vicky, I'd like to ask you your background to share with us your interest in this area.
Sure. I was actually hoping I was going to go last. Just to briefly explain, the current role that I have is I teach leadership, and I run a leadership program in general practice. So I work predominantly with GPs, and there's a whole, the conversations around social determinants of health are really, really important there. In addition to that, I'm also a postgrad student in social impact at University of Western Australia, so UWA, where there's some really important conversations happening around social change and social justice and what that means. And until recently, I was also on the board of a women's refuge for women escaping from family and domestic violence. So I am part of a number of conversations in WA, actually between here and the US, about the various forms that violence takes and financial abuse. I also experienced that as a child of financial abuse. I don't see myself as a victim in this conversation. I think that a lot of people probably wouldn't. So I just want to be really clear about that. I just feel that my experience could have been changed in a number of ways, and I'm really keen to see how that change can be supported, and how can we be human about our interactions with people who are in financial services themselves, and they could be experiencing financial abuse. So how do we help each other? That's fundamentally where I come from.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Vicky. Mel.
Great. My name's Mel Voidis. I'm a single mum of two, based in Sydney at the moment. I've got 3 decades worth of lived expertise with domestic and family abuse, sexual assault, financial abuse, coercive control, living with a parent with complex mental health issues, and suicide of a parent. And a whole plethora of things that stem from trauma, such as chronic health, overcoming an addiction. Just basically my whole life has been a series of adverse events. So I'm actually quite focused on creating as much social impact from that trauma as I can. So I'm currently a media advocate with Domestic Violence New South Wales, with Women's Safety New South Wales. I also do my own consulting and speaking as well. And I'm also creating trauma-informed survivor homes in regional Australia.
Wow. Thank you, Vicky. Nicole.
Hi. Okay, so my name's Nicole Lee, and I'm a survivor advocate of domestic and family violence, and I've been working in this space for the past 3 years. Now, I escaped violence back in 2014, just before the Royal Commission into family violence happened in Victoria. So I was invited to give evidence at the Royal Commission after I gave a submission. And from that, I've been working on the Victim Survivors Advisory Council, which has been advising the Victorian government on the reforms that have been happening down here in Victoria. So I've got to do work on some really cool changes happening, things around our specialist family violence courts, our support and safety hubs called the Orange Door. And from working in that world, I've then got to go and and I work alongside with Women with Disabilities Victoria. So I get to sit on a whole heap of different working groups. I've just been appointed to one for Our Watch, for an expert advisory group. Yeah, so it's a really busy, big space, and it's really good to see the voice of victim survivors starting to be embedded more broadly across the reforms. We're just starting to kind of sort of pause and have a look at how we're embedding the voice of victim survivors, how can it be done better, and how can we bring in more voices into this space to sort of underpin, all the different things that, if we're going to be using public money and funds and things to build new structures, how do we bring the people in who have been affected to oversee and to be experts in their own right in this space alongside all the other experts and alongside all the other major stakeholders as well. So it's it's been an interesting space. It's very healing for myself, and it's been a huge part of my recovery journey and learning to understand what I've been through and unpack everything that I've been through as well.
Thank you, Nicole. Wow, what amazing group of ladies we have here today. Your backgrounds, your courage, your strength, it's also very inspiring, and I do thank you for joining us in what I believe is a really important topic and something we just don't talk enough about. Yes, there's more awareness about domestic violence. Yes, there's more awareness about mental health and suicide prevention, but there isn't enough discussion, I don't believe, and I'd be looking forward to your own thoughts on this around the interrelationship to what it means with financial abuse and family violence, and what the interlinks are between all of those different elements of consequences that may or may not occur in people. And I think, Nicole, well, actually all of you have raised some really important points that would be great to perhaps unpeel and talk a bit more about in the next hour or so. So the first part of my question is, what's the role of gender equality with the banks and the financial institutions? What can we help them with, and what can we ask them to actually concentrate on when we're looking at this topic of gender equality? Kathy?
I think the banks need to stop, or I say banks and financial sectors, so we'll abbreviate. I think they need to stop looking at this space as a corporate social responsibility issue. This is a whole of community responsibility and response, and they need to address the intersectionality of their products and services and responses with family law, insurance, housing, mental health rather than silo their approach. They also need to take into consideration the fact that these women, and I know it affects men as well, domestic family violence, but they're highly traumatised and often not in the adequate space to be explaining the complexity of what's gone on. And language is critical around that. For example, one of the banks the other day, preparing for this, I read they have a domestic and family violence policy, but they talk about people who are victim survivors. They talk about poor financial management as part of their language. I can tell you, every single woman I have chaplain to, poor financial management doesn't come into it. There's violence involved, as Rachel said earlier. If you've got to give them money, you give them money, or you just want to be safe. And that's part of the problem. The other issue is adequate training at the front line, which comes up time and time again. We had a discussion this morning where online learning doesn't cut it. You know, you have to have lived experience. If it costs you more money to fly them around the country, so be it. People need to get the heart and soul of what this actually means. And you know, there are lots of stories of people overcoming adversity and reclaiming their lives and going on to bigger and better things in really amazing ways in lots of spheres of life. And the financial sector needs to stop thinking of vulnerability and start thinking about empowerment. So that's my interest.
Thank you, Kathy. And I think that's really key, is that empowerment and that trying to encourage banks to be hopeful and helping their clients to be optimistic about rebuilding themselves.
Yeah, I might just interrupt, because I think that point, I've been lucky enough to have spoken privately with Vicky, and depending upon what you want to share, Vicky, her story from childhood, I think really illustrates where banks once were, you know, the sense of community and what they were able to do, and we've lost that.
Sure. Essentially, I grew up in Ireland until about the age of 9, and during the recession that occurred in Ireland in the mid-80s, my family relocated to the UK in circumstances I didn't wholly understand at the time, except that my father had lost his business, as many people did. And over a period of time, we rebuilt everything back up for a number of years, until we believed we were selling our house, and we moved into another property which we were renting. We then went through a succession of different rentals. So in the space of 18 months, at about the age of 16, we moved 6 or 7 times. And as a family of 7, that wasn't a small feat. Then one day, my mum sat us down and told me that she and Dad were separating, and it transpired that 2 members of the bank manager and one of his team, had turned up at the front door and sat her down and laid out some documents in which they showed her that her signature had been forged on a number of checks.
Are you okay there, Vicky?
Yeah, so we hadn't actually moved out of the supposed desire to move to a better house. We had moved because my father had defaulted on the mortgage and had forged my mum's financial documentation. So one of the reasons I'm upset is that only by joining a women's refuge did I realise that this actually was an issue that presents itself for many women and children. And the ramifications of that are so significant that we don't even for people who are experiencing it, we don't even know what's happening to ourselves sometimes. And it takes people like that bank manager turning up and being compassionate and not blaming my mum for what had happened. And in fact, when she spoke to him afterwards, he said, "We see this every single day." And that bank has subsequently been taken over, and it was a small bank. And that act was a turning point for my family. Now, there was a lot of stuff that happened afterwards. And the difficulty that presented itself for me in the 2 years that followed was as a result of having to move property several times, and the requirements that go with your credibility and your status financially. If you have moved properties in a succession of times, then your credit rating goes down. So as I left home, I moved out of home. Mum had set up she was really tried to establish herself really well, but I moved out of home and I wanted to have my own stronger financial dealings, obviously. I applied for a normal bank account as opposed to a savings bank account. And in the bank, I was told by the person handling it that there was a problem with my application. So this was one of the bigger banks that supplied sort of student accounts and things like that, so that you could, there was an incentive to join. And they said, you need to speak to the underwriter because there's actually an issue. And I'm not a shy and retiring person, so I said, well, what was the problem? And he laughed at me and said, well, you've moved house a lot of times in the past 18 months, haven't you? And the shame in that moment, the association that somehow I had done something wrong stayed with me for quite a long time. And as a consequence of that, I've been very lucky in that I have a very strong mum who re-educated herself with 5 children, took herself back to university after the first instance in which we thought it was a simple case of just losing the business. I had a really strong role model for getting yourself back on your feet when something goes wrong. But I didn't have good financial advice from an early age. And if someone had said to me, what is happening, instead of mocking me, that could have been really helpful for me in just being smart about my money later down the track. Now, that is actually a very easy story compared to what happened to other people in the family and to friends that have basically lost money. One of my brothers has the same name as my father. My father fraudulently passed funds through his account. And at the age of 14, he had to go into the bank and justify his identity and rebuild his financial status. I mean, 14 is nothing. So and the fragmentation that occurs for someone who suddenly your identity is called into question. I can't even imagine what happens to people whose identity gets completely stolen or whose partner somehow has control entirely over their accounts. I just can't imagine that. But I always come back to that decision that was made by that person to go and knock on the front door and say, there's something wrong. That's a deeply compassionate thing to do. And why can't that be replicated? Because that's a good story. That's a good story of somebody doing the right thing.
Thank you, Vicky.
Group hug.
I want to give you a big hug. I feel useless just sitting here.
Oh, no, thank you. It's thank you. It wasn't my intention to cry. It's just when I revisit that moment, and also it was really confronting when I discovered all of these definitions only in the past 12 months, and I've never seen myself as a victim. And whilst I believe people need to acknowledge that there are victims and what that means. And I don't want to somehow diminish that in any way. I just, that's not how I see myself, and nobody in my family would see themselves in that way either. And people have problems, and we don't know how to. So my father has significant challenges. So where was the point before that where that could have been addressed? So thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you for your courage, and it's okay to feel what you feel. And if you don't mind me asking the question, what support have you had now that has enabled you to now be a voice?
I believe that it's a mixture of knowledge sharing that occurs amongst people who work in the sector. I've connected with a number of people internationally as well as within Australia. I have also reached out to the local community, partly through my studies and through my work people, Aboriginal leaders, leaders in their sector, as opposed to elders, who have extraordinary wisdom and understanding about human dynamics and the strengths that that is within people and allows them to harness what they have and then move on. So I think it's people, it's connection that has changed it for me, and knowledge.
Knowledge is power. Thank you so much, Vicky. I'd like to actually now ask Mel the same question about what your thinking is around what the institutions and financial institutions can do around gender equality.
Oh, a few things. I would actually, I'm not too sure about gender equality, but I just know I'm very in line with what Kathy mentioned and probably what some other advocates might have said this morning, and that online modules and training isn't enough, and having lived expertise in the room, or even training by Our Watch, things like that, wondering whether Our Watch can even guide them into how they do their communication, out to the community, just in the same way that they guide the media on best practice. Getting lived expertise in the room, face to face, linking them in with stories so that they can't ignore it. Putting some emotion and humanity back into the policies that they've got. So I'm not too sure what they can do about equality. I know ratios to me feel a bit tokenistic, but even just focusing, I don't really like equality because I'm more of an equity person and moving forward to, so I think for me it would be providing more equitable solutions to marginalised groups, not just gender equality, but actual equity for anybody who really truly needs a leg up, and multiply marginalised people getting access to things like interest-free loans, or just really evening the playing field so we have the same starting position, not just, tokenistic gender ratios, I guess. Yeah.
I actually agree with you. It's about equity. Yeah, maybe, Ingrid, I don't think you're aware that Mel Silver, she did introduce it, setting up your own social enterprise for housing. Do you want to talk to that? Because I think that's really relevant about equity for all people.
If it's appropriate to talk about, sure. So it's called High Village Project, and I've been researching through my own lived experience and frustration at being turned away from shelters and being told to call back in 6 months, or from friends who have had a part-time job and they're ineligible to get emergency accommodation, and just all the different barriers, and realising how many people are actually being missed in crisis accommodation and post-crisis. So people in the LGBTIQ community, which I'm part of, and people with disabilities, and people with pets, and people with teenage sons who are deemed a risk in specialist homelessness shelters. And, you know, my kids are quite far apart in age, and even just the thought of only bringing one child with me if I needed to access crisis accommodation is just unthinkable. So you see, when you really start drilling down how many barriers there are, it's huge. So when I started thinking, you know, there's got to be another way, and kind of had my Phoenix moment of, you know, losing everything and starting over just from sheer rage at the system and injustice, I guess, decided to create a solution that would fix as many of those barriers or reduce them as much as possible. So I'm co-designing housing with other survivors, so it'll be trauma-informed, universally designed, fully accessible, inclusive of LGBTIQ community, pet-friendly, self-contained accommodation rather than high density, because, you know, with survivors, we've got PTSD, you know, that's kind of a given. So whacking a lot of traumatized people in high density, and the noise, even the stress of that, or communal living, can be another barrier. And even sharing one shelter with 5 other traumatized families can be a barrier to people getting help. So, and really just focusing on the equity. So focusing on remote, rural, regional places in Australia that are, you know, few and far between of places to go. So that's kind of the rest of the life legacy that I'm hoping to leave behind, is equity in permanent housing, not just short-term or transitional or crisis, but permanent, basically a forever home for people and their animals. Yeah, so that's my jam.
Thank you,
Thank you for letting me talk about that. Yeah, thank you.
Nicole, I'd like to ask your perspective.
So when we talk about gender equality, it has to be intersectional, and we have to start looking at people as not just two-dimensional things. So I have a disability and I use a wheelchair, but I'm more than just a woman with a disability. We're complex people. And this, I guess, you know, when we talk about gender equality, is starting to bring in those intersecting layers and how those layers add up for an individual, that creates more barriers and more complex barriers and an increase in marginalisation when trying to sort of get your foot in the door as a woman into the gender equality you know, debate and world. And when it comes to, I guess, the banks, and it's like everybody has said, getting people with lived experience into the rooms, and not in a tokenistic way. Don't just get us to come and have a keynote speech. Don't just get us to come and present to you to different places so everybody feels motivated to go away and do better. Actually start looking at people with lived experiences as experts. Now, I've got to work a couple of times integrally with design teams. So rather than just coming in as a bit of a consultant here and there, and it's really more consultation rather than co-design, but, you know, we tend to call it co-design instead, is actually embedding people into teams from the very beginning and working throughout the project until it's and yeah, to see the project to the end. You know, and doing that across all the different, you know, things that you're designing, whether it's policy, whether it's new technology with apps, or you know, all the different bits and pieces that are being designed, is having the people, you know, different people with lived experience in those teams and recognising their expertise as being you know, an area that is professional. There's a lot of us starting to work in this space, and it is growing and building, and we're trying to sort of like define, well, what actually constitutes a lived experience of family violence, and what actually constitutes you know, embedding somebody into that, and how do we do that? And it's, you know, there's wrong ways to do it, but there's certainly many ways in which we can do this, and it's constantly evolving. So it's sort of like when you start thinking about gender equality and you start thinking about family violence and intersectionality, is that think outside the box and start just using different ideas and being adventurous, because it's evolving constantly. It's really evolving constantly. And like I said, you know, I don't think there's a wrong, well, I think there is a wrong way to do it, but yeah, just try something. And if it doesn't work, well, then you go back to the beginning again and try something again, and do this iterative design with people beside you that have lived it and experienced it. we've all got a different experience when it comes to financial abuse or the other forms of family violence, and we've all got a different perspective to bring to the table as well. So it's also about not just having one or two people in there. It's getting a wide range of voices into this space as well. Yep.
Well, that's a really important point that you've made about co-design and bringing the lived experience to the table. What do you think is the biggest barrier for the sector when it comes to including more people with the voice of their lived experiences and to co-design as opposed to being tokenistic and ticking boxes to say, yes, we've done that bit?
I think it's a bit of a fear because it's something that hasn't really been done very much in the past, and it, as I said, it is something that's new, and it's a little bit scary. And also when you start thinking about lived experience, well, what is that as a qualification? How do we quantify what is a lived experience as being somebody's qualification to be able to actually jump into the job or jump into a design team and be able to roll with it and learn and evolve and be an integral part of that team? And it is new and it's scary, and it takes I guess people to just really, like I said, just step outside that box, really make a role for somebody to come in and work with the team as a proper team member, as a professional, and be ready to run with that, and to break down a lot of those stigmas and stereotypes around typecasting people with lived experience of family violence, and that's all our expertise is, and that's all we're capable of talking about, that we're actually we can be quite skilled designers and thought leaders and all sorts of things in this space, and we do have skills outside of what we've experienced. We're more than the sum of the things that have happened to us, and and we're really quite smart people, and for a lot of us, I know a lot of the other advocates as well, is that once you start coming into this world, you're reading reports, you're listening to other stories, you're educating yourself, you're learning, you're up to date with all, like I know myself in Victoria, up to date with all of the reforms that are happening across Victoria, and then across the rest of the country. So we're a wealth of knowledge that is so underutilized, especially when somebody comes in and just says, hey, this is what we've designed, what do you reckon? Like, that's not co-design, no matter how many post-it notes you stick on it. If you're coming in at the end saying this is what we've done, let's write some post-it notes. Nah, that we can we can spell that out a mile away, and we feel patronized as well. And I love it when I get brought in at the beginning, and just start bringing in people and stop being afraid of this unknown, because this unknown is an untapped wealth of knowledge and expertise.
That's a terrific response, Nicole. So confident, you've said it so confidently and concisely, because it's such a complex area. And I'm just wondering, you said fear is one of the issues. Is there something else that seems to be a barrier for services to be reluctant to include the lived experience at the centre of the conversation?
Yeah, I think the other fear, I guess, which I didn't touch on, is around, people with lived experience are too traumatized or they're too broken to work in this space. And if we ask them, are we asking too much? Or, are we going to, and we talk about vicarious trauma, and are we going to impact this person and cause more harm than what we're actually going to gain in the way of good? And it's a matter of, trust the person with the lived experience to know where their boundaries are. Set the parameters for your team, make sure there's all these supports in place. But, we're actually pretty tough. And we know when we've done too much. We know when to push back, and we know when to stop. And we're pretty attuned with looking after ourselves in this space. And I think there's this real big fear around wanting to protect people with lived experience and not to use them. And, the best way to not overuse someone or abuse somebody's lived experience is pay them. Pay somebody for the work they're doing, especially for banks. I mean, really, especially for banks. And especially within the sector. That's what I mean.
Free labor.
Make a role, make a position available for somebody to come in and work in a design team, to bring in their lived experience and to help design as like a UX designer, so to speak. Yes. And actually pay them and recognise them as well as being part of the team. I've done lots of work where I haven't got recognition for what I've done, and I've got minimal kind of pay, but it's just that sort of paternalistic fear that they have, and this paternalistic nature they have around, we need to protect, and that's actually a barrier to including. And I think it gets used as an excuse to not include because people just don't know how to do it. If you don't know how to do it, then go and ask somebody who's done it before. There's plenty of information and knowledge, and there's plenty of people out there with lots of knowledge, and ask them how to do it as well. If that is your fear, then go and find information of how to do it properly and how to do it ethically.
Thank you.
I jump in, Ingrid, because you've raised such a great point, Nicole. Do you, particularly the banking and finance sector, they're really great at having focus groups, bringing in lived experience and giving a token contribution amount for, thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. Do you think co-design is even on their agenda?
Well, no. I think, when they come in with that angle, I think, I think they're doing it really purely because they feel that they have to, and they're not quite sure how to really do it. And, when you start thinking people with lived experience, there's this power imbalance, like, well, we're really educated and we know what we're talking about because we work in this bank and this is our job and we design these things. And what would you know? You've just experienced it. And not recognizing the value in that there is a lot of expertise in being an expert in the human experience of the services that are being designed and how that fits in, with design teams. And that, if you hold these focus groups, what is really the value you're getting out of that? Because that's tokenism, and you get some post-it notes, you get a few little insights here and there. But when one of the best projects I've got to work on so far has been developing an app and learning how this iterative design, and we go and we expand our knowledge and let's go and find the problem. And then we focus it back in, and then we design a little bit, and then we go back again and check it all and test it and user testing and all of that. And how important that is to have the people on the end, the human face of it involved the whole way along, that you end up with a product that is usable, wanted, needed, and will last, and value for money as well, rather than let's just do a focus group kind of in the middle towards the end and get some insights. And we do the same with government policy. I mean, they do the same with policy. They'll go and they do great big statewide consultations and then write this beautiful piece of policy that's inherently flawed because they've gotten things wrong. And if you're not constantly asking people the whole way along, oh, you said this, is this really what you meant? No, actually, that's wrong. This is actually what I meant. If we just get those insights and then take what we think, what the designers think is the meaning from it, well, you tend to get things wrong. You get nuances wrong and you make mistakes, and then you end up with something that just doesn't work and doesn't fit its purpose in the end. And it just seems like such a waste of money because, and how it could be done better if it's a little bit more investment in time, a little bit more investment in money, but in the long term saves a lot more money. And the people on the end user is happier and gets the things that they need too at the end of it, and the support that they need.
It's also got another overlay that it's very validating for survivors working in those organisations to suddenly realise that they're co-designing their experience. It's valued, it's empowering, and the organisation they're working for is actually listening to that community. And we spoke about this morning with AI and the fact that 90% of AI applications have errors in the early days. Huge issue, but those that will be impacted most, and I'm talking about the banking and finance sector with that, are women and minority groups. So therefore, by allowing them to co-design from the beginning, you were addressing that and not just saying, we need to think about ethics somewhere over there.
You're problem solving the whole way along with the end user. And it's a beautiful recipe to design things that fit the community that you're designing them for. Why wouldn't you involve the people in the community that are, as I said, the human face of who you're delivering the service to? Instead of telling people this is a service you want, asking people what is the service you need.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to go and ask actually Mel and Vicky now. Mel first, What do you think of what Nicole and Kathy have been saying around this whole issue of co-design and working together in a different way to the way has been quite commonly done and as a box exercise?
Thank you. I completely agree with everything that Nicole has just said. So thank you. I'm sorry that I cut you off before, but as soon as you said pay them, I was like, yes. One of actually some of my favourite advocacy work this year has actually been co-design. And because I've signed some NDAs, I can't actually tell you about it, but it's been really rewarding to actually be treated like an expert in the area, not just tokenism, you know, here's a little voucher off you go. It's been really, and it doesn't even feel like work to me. It's actually like I feel like I'm actually in my element. I'm able to contribute something that is seen as, you know, needed and valued, and know that that has the potential, if a pilot goes ahead, to actually make life easier for other survivors. I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving. And I would just be so proud to know and look back if that does roll out, that I even had like one tiny part of that. You know, that's really rewarding for me. And it feels like soul work, you know, just helping other people on an organisational level with policy and that sort of thing. One good feedback would be, yeah, pay us, but not also a discounted rate. Pay us the normal consulting rate that you would pay somebody else that has a uni degree. You know, there might not be a uni degree for abuse, but you can't actually teach this stuff. If you really want to get to the nitty-gritty of coercive control, you can't get that from a classroom. You can only get that from living it. So the only way you're going to get that is by tapping into the people who have lived that themselves. You know, it's not worth nothing. Yeah, so I get very excited when the word co-design comes up, because that's my jam. And yeah, just paying people for their time too. You know, I think one of the biggest traps that people can fall into is that once you start doing survivor advocacy, everyone just will keep asking and asking and asking more and more of you until you actually have to put the boundary in for yourself and just say, I can't just work for free indefinitely. You know, it might work in the beginning, and there are some things that you probably want to do free of charge, but there's also, I think if it was something like a lawyer, it would just be a given. Nobody would actually have to ask, are you paying me for that? You know, it would just be assumed that you're paying for this person's knowledge and time and effort, so you're gonna charge for it. Whereas I think when you get into the advocacy space, some people still have the expectation that, you know, I think we can just, they're just going to do this out of the love, you know, for other people. And, you know, that might work for a while and for certain things, but not, it shouldn't be the default, in my opinion.
I have a statement that I say to people: I have a biological problem, I have to eat.
Yes.
And then I'm very quiet. And in this area of advocacy, it's a bit of a contradiction that they're asking for support and asking for, in the case you mentioned, Mel, some degree of co-design, but there isn't this market rate that this could bring in, you know, thousands of dollars if we get this right. I mean, tens of thousands of dollars. Therefore, you're valued at just as much as any other contributing member. We're not, you know, devaluing it. Really important.
And yet we're in a society where society does value what it pays for, unfortunately, and giving things away constantly demeans that to all of us. So I so agree with what you've been saying around the whole prospect of giving that sense of symbolism. And it is an income. If we're going to be doing this as a professional group of people, then we do also need to eat, as Kathy said, but we've also got to keep abreast of what's going on. The complex reading, the being ahead of what's going on around us and in the sector takes time, takes effort. And so we do deserve to be remunerated. And I suppose this is where that element is getting more and more talked about Yes, it might be seen by some to be thrown around, but I was actually going to ask Vicky, you're the sort of the next person who hasn't mentioned what your thoughts are around co-design and how we can better intertwine the lived experience with what the community is doing and what the sector is doing for domestic violence, family violence, and financial abuse.
So I agree with what Mel and Nicole have both described, and I think it's an extraordinary experience to work alongside a skilled designer, because one, their comfort with discomfort and someone's experience allows that person to better express what their experience has been in the first instance, as opposed to a focus group environment where if you go in, have the conversation, go away and potentially do nothing or misinterpret, you've disempowered that individual. So really skilled designers are phenomenal in how they understand systems and also how they can unearth solutions for the greater good. And so that bit around value, whether it's financial or whether you know that somewhere along the way your contribution has helped another individual who would have been very negatively impacted otherwise, is really liberating and really healing as well for the people that have been through it. And my whole view on all of my experiences in life, that was one experience in life that I had. I later ended up with cancer 10 years later, and I've had a miscarriage, and I've had all of these life experiences where I look at it and I think, how can I interact with other people living the same experience in a way that helps them feel more connected, more powerful in themselves, that they have choices in life. Because if we have choices, that's so much better than feeling like you're in that trap, that there's no way out. And then you end up looking, down some pretty awful alternatives. So the challenge that exists, I believe, right now, though, is that even knowing what design thinking or the skill of designing is a gap in itself, and valuing knowledge, so that the knowledge that goes with it is so important. And if we're going to continue down the route that we are, in terms of only valuing certain skills and paying to a certain level for those skills, then effectively we cut off a whole, vast majority of society, really. And we need to be much more, much closer to each other, not operating in these silos of professions, which someone's already talked about. The putting people into buckets of you're this and you're that is really not getting us anywhere. And the other thing that I would say, I've done a lot of interviewing for the leadership program that I run, so I'm very lucky to get to talk to people all over the world in all different sets of circumstances. And there was one individual who, so this is somebody in New York that I interviewed on the topic of advocacy, and what he said stuck with me so much through all of this. So his name's Marlon Peterson, and he was in prison for 10 years for armed robbery, and he's come out since then and talks about his role in interactions with people, the work that he needs to do in the community, how other people have experienced abuse, what that's meant, his experience of trauma as of sexual assault as a 14-year-old, and what that's meant. And he said to me, you have to center the person. So you put that person in front of you. All of your decision making is based around that individual. So if you're doing that, then your own ego isn't interfering with it. Because I think quite often, and I've certainly been guilty in the past, is, oh yes, I can fix this, I can fix this, I can fix this. But it's then about me, it's not about the person. And that centering, that role of centering the person in advocacy is absolutely critical. And that's what really, I think, is where change can happen alongside the design thinking.
I think you've made a really important point there, Vicky, around the power of advocacy and that need for the voice, that lived experience voice, to help bring the narrative to actually the financial sector that doesn't seem to actually have much of an understanding. It's had put in erroneous, put in some really difficult processes in place for people to have to jump hoops in order to be able to get help, and then they seem to be lacking. What sort of thing can we do to actually bring support in for people who may be victims of this sort of abuse?
Do you know what's coming up for me in this conversation, and I wasn't expecting it to go in this direction, it's very interesting, is the disconnect in those wanting, corporations, banking and finance, in good nature, wanting to try and help, but the disconnect between mental health and financial abuse and domestic and family violence. Like, we've got our mental health program over here, and now we're doing something for domestic and family violence. Oh, and by the way, we recognise there are vulnerable groups, and here's our financial program. They haven't got it. They just haven't got. And listening to Vicky's story, what we're talking about, intergenerational trauma, which is very, very common. And as Vicky showed, it impacts you like dramatically throughout your whole life, to the point that she's still getting emotional around, reliving that experience or revisiting that experience. But you have caseworkers, front of office people that are given, as we spoke earlier, a module of training, and okay, off you go. Because I know for a fact that a lot of them just do a module of training in mental health. That doesn't equip people to deal with what we're talking about. Like, how, and one size in terms of support products and programs, particularly in domestic and family violence, you can't put a square into a circle. It just doesn't fit. You need to have human decision-making or co-design around all of that.
That's a really important point, Kathy. Vicky, did you want to add anything to that? Because that was something that Kathy has actually expressed really well, and I was thinking about what's been the impact to you from that mental health perspective.
Of my own experience?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
If you're comfortable in sharing that.
Yeah, the thing is, it's complex because it's not just that interaction. It's multiple interactions with different organizations, and what do you hide? What do you hide from people? And really, it's try and hide as much as possible in those circumstances. You don't want people to know that essentially you've been homeless and shunted around from house to house, and then you've had difficulty getting any sort of bank account, and and beneath that is shame. So when I think about other adverse experiences that I might have had, like cancer, I don't feel ashamed about having cancer. It's just my body didn't work. And I've been really lucky that I've had really good treatment and been fully supported all the way through that. But from a mental health perspective, yeah, if you immerse somebody in shame, how are they supposed to climb out of it? And what's the trigger point then for anything else that happens, whether it's an interaction in the street with somebody? If somebody's just having that they're carrying that with them, and they're going into all interactions in the street with an employer, trying to engage with any service, and anger sits behind that, then your interactions, my interactions, would be very negative, because I would be coming from the supposition that people are against me. So I have to fight my own corner, and I have to fight it hard, which then creates a lot of confrontation in life. And luckily I don't occupy that space mentally now, but that's a lot of things to try and climb out of. And there are people who've been through way worse than I have. I'm sure Mel and Nicole, just hearing what you've touched on, I haven't heard about your individual experiences to any depth. I mean, I'm looking at you guys thinking, oh my God, this is just, my experience is nothing compared to what you have been through, and I'm sure. So there's a little part of me inside going, oh my God, I'm so ashamed that I just cried about something that really shouldn't be that.
Oh, please don't.
No. But I'm saying that not for reassurance. I'm saying it, that other people will feel the same ways. I can't tell you that, because that would be, if I cry, then, you know, and you've been really kind in that interaction and acknowledged me and made me feel heard. But how many people are willing to do that?
And that's what we're trying to change together, Vicky, is by encouraging other people to listen, to understand, not listen to why.
Yes.
And so give us that acknowledgement of pain, of our lived experience. So then perhaps all of our institutions and all of our organisations can better understand the humanness that lies behind us, rather than us working very much in processes and systems. I would like to take your question up, Vicky, to Mel and to Nicole, around what has your lived experience looked like, if you're comfortable in sharing, around your mental health and physical health.
Yeah, so I guess from my lived experience of violence, went over the course of 10 years, and it was financial, it was emotional, it was physical, sexual, it was all of it. And, that's had a huge impact. And one thing I'll touch on with the financial abuse is that it's the gift that keeps on giving. And, the debt that just keeps on, it's there, and I'll be paying it off for maybe the next 25 years. All the debt that's been left for myself to pay off as a woman with a disability, and bring up 2 children as well. So there's lots of impacting things, and the impact that all of that has had on my mental health is that, I do live with complex trauma, and I suffer things, what they call disassociation. So if I'm majorly triggered, and luckily, touch wood, it hasn't happened in public too much, in that I don't know who I am, I don't know where I am, and I don't know kind of even what time period I'm in. Like, I don't know. I just kind of revert back to a younger age, and it's very confronting for my partner, who's had to sit with me through these things, and it is confronting for other people. For me, it's just confusing, and I come out of it and I just don't know what's going on, and I just feel kind of lost and confused and a little detached for a while. But things such as, when I was pulled out of that world and police came in and removed my husband from the house, I got thrown into this world of, I'd never done anything online. I hadn't, I wasn't allowed to do any online banking. I wasn't allowed to understand that world. I wasn't allowed to pay bills. So I all of a sudden got thrown into, every time I'd call someone, they said, well, you can jump online and you can go and do X, Y, Z. And I had no idea what I was doing. And it was so scary. And I was, living in so much fear and confusion. Trying to get myself out of, my husband's just been removed. Well, how do I get the kids to school? How do I take care of myself? I'm disabled. I need carers. I need support. This whole world, and then I'm trying to navigate this online world where are all our debts? Where is our money gone to? Where is my money coming from? How am I paying my bills? Who are even the bills with? And that has resulted in, whenever I have to engage with online forums, is that I get a fair bit of, I get fairly triggered when having to navigate things like net banking or paying bills online or doing all of these different things. We're building these beautiful online platforms. Only problem is, for somebody like myself, that puts me straight back into those moments straight after he was removed, and it puts me straight back into that very distressing point in time in my life. I'll work on my mental health probably. I'll be working on that for the rest of my life. I'll be unpacking that 10 years, I think forever. And, that's just all part of this journey. And I don't think you're ever not on the journey of recovery on your way out of this. And that's, the beautiful thing about getting to come in and do all this kind of work and this co-designing work and working in this area is that it's been helping me hearing other people's stories, and hearing my own story. And then I've got my little story here, and then I start thinking about it. This is my experience. Well, what does that mean in the broader context of the community that I represent and the people around me and the community that I exist in? And what does that mean more broadly in the whole of the society, the state, the nation? And you start to look at this is my little experience, isolated experience here, and this, what does all of this mean in the grander scheme of the reforms? And it's, you don't feel as alone. And you know, the mental health stuff, it gets better over time. I don't think it ever goes away. And I think when people start to feel that recovery has an end date, or you know, to be recovered means you need to be completely, you know, absolved of all of these thoughts and fears and feelings, and I think that's setting people up to fail. And I think the way that I handle my mental health now and handle my triggers is better, and it impacts me less. But to think that one day I'm going to wake up and it's all going to be gone, you know, it's not going to happen. And for every other person out there that's been through this, is that, you know, if you're waiting for that to happen, then, you know, stop looking for that and start seeing all of the things that are really good that are going on for you right now, and start seeing all the progress that you have made, rather than thinking that you haven't done enough, and start looking at all the things that you have actually done.
Nicole, I'm going to have to interject, because I'm now noticing the time and thinking,
Yep, sure.
wow, we've actually come to the close. So I was actually going to say thank you to all of you. Amazing souls, and I just can't thank you enough for bearing your pain and your lived experience, and it will certainly be helping countless other people to actually be able to navigate their journeys just a little less, hopefully isolated, and maybe feeling like, you know, others have gone through this journey too. So thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.